absolutely cannot have hydraulic fracturing in our economy. We can't have it. It is way too destructive. There are way too many communities, especially in the rural parts of the country. Colorado even comes to mind. Communities get destroyed. Their clean drinking water is devastated from fracking, as well as the man-made earthquakes that get created from this. And you brought up a great point, which is I actually do think that the next phase of nuclear energy is how we're going to deal with one of the biggest topics you mentioned in the book is intermittency. So if we're going to be able to deal with the shortcomings of particularly solar and wind, which is it's not always windy and it's not always light outside, you have to be able to deal with that. And I believe that the new technology in terms of nuclear is how we transition away from coal and natural gas. How do you guys feel about the next, the next integration, if you will, of, as you said, now a lot of people are talking about nuclear, but it is the best option we have if we're going to get away from fossil fuels.
And I think the challenge again is that you could argue the regulatory costs, the not in my backyard problems with building a nuclear plant has made it very difficult to build. There were countries like France who actually had massive penetration of nuclear, upwards of 80–90% of their generation was there. They've actually been rolling back. Japan, not surprisingly, rolling back from nuclear. So again, I don't disagree with you that it could be part of that transition in that future state, but it's just interesting to note there's just not a lot of activity in that space. We do know that there is some really interesting innovation happening in what they call modular nuclear, so smaller nuclear plants that could reduce some of the risks associated with the larger plants we're kind of used to in society. And there very well could be additional advances that occur that make it a more attractive piece of the puzzle here. But just right now, it's just not actively really being pursued by electric utilities and the like.
I think that people are fixated in like a 1950s mentality of what nuclear is. And they're just not capable of understanding. And it hasn't been presented either. It's been sort of like it's been presented in a very fearful way. That's just generally what you see in the news are all the horrible things. And it's never presented rationally.
Becky, if you want to chime in, I mean, my thought is that the reason why nuclear doesn't get as much of a platform is because it actually could, I'm trying to get the right word, but it could actually undercut a lot of what the fossil fuel industry relies upon in terms of economic sustainability. And I think that if we did have nuclear, that would hurt them a lot. And anytime you notice an industry that could mitigate the problem but isn't being talked about, there's probably a good reason behind it.
Well, and the other challenge that nuclear, at least traditional nuclear, when we're talking about large nuclear, it's extremely expensive to build new facilities, right? And a good portion of nuclear in the US is going to age out in the next 10, 15 years. And so we're faced with the challenge of, do you invest in those facilities so that they can last longer? Do you invest in perhaps modular nuclear that could be rolled out, commercialized, distributed more quickly and less costly? So I mean, I think there is still a role to play here for nuclear. And last time I was listening to someone from the DOE speak about some of the things that they are working on, SMRs was on the list. So I mean, I think this is a place where the federal government can make a huge impact in terms of investing in new technologies and helping to scale and commercialize them.
That's a great point. And again, the modular concept of nuclear energy, I think, is really what you need. And again, Michael, you did bring up the idea of not in my backyard. Well, the same can be said of fracking as well. And so we're kind of in one of those tricky situations, but I do think that that's a very good transition to the construction component of what you talk about, because look, love him or hate him, Elon Musk obviously has been a very strong proponent of new construction being completely carbon neutral. The solar panel roofs that get built, I think that's a great concept. And again, a lot of times we as Americans, we're extremely vapid in the way we like things presented to us. A lot of people didn't want to drive an electric car early on because it looked like a space mobile. They would rather drive a car that looks like a car. So changing the body style was very important. And the same is true, I believe, of solar panels. A lot of people don't necessarily want to see, solar panels on their roofs, but the new construction concept that Tesla came out with is to basically have these solar panels on the roof, and you can't really tell that they're solar panels. It looks like it's just part of the construction of the home. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that. And then another issue that I don't think it's talked about enough, we have so many dilapidated properties all throughout this country, and all these developers try to do is just build more and more and more, where again, it is a cost factor, it's a time factor, but there seems to be a lot of empty space that could be utilized if we simply went through the process of, obviously deconstructing some of these older properties that are not useful anymore and could build them up into green space. Your thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think you're exactly right that there's an opportunity here to build what we would call kind of distributed power systems. So if you think about the traditional way that we, generate electricity, it's, large plants that are then tied into an electrical grid that then you consume that electricity. I think the future vision that people are seeing is, imagine people have a battery powered electric vehicle in their driveway. They've got some solar panels on the roof. Maybe they have a battery stack in the garage, and these can work dynamically with the grid, so that at various times you're consuming electricity, and at other times you're actually producing electricity that you sell back to the grid. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to start to deal with that intermittency problem in some really creative ways. We didn't get to talk about this with nuclear, but nuclear is very good as a base load, but you don't really ramp up and down nuclear power plants. So what you really need is to be able to hit the changing demand that you have over time for electricity over the course of, let's say, the day. And so if you have, again, batteries in the home and solar on the roof, you can start to create these kind of dynamic markets here of trading of electricity that allows you to kind of solve the intermittency problem and actually kind of reduce the cost of producing electricity. Now, the challenge, you pointed out, is how do we then convince builders and retrofitting existing construction to adopt these types of technology? And that's where, in the book, we talk about policy kind of writ large, and, hundreds of different things that could be done on a local level or a state level to try to change building codes and the like, to try to drive some of these changes.
I definitely agree. And Becky, please.
Yeah, no, maybe I'm jumping into our favorite sector a little bit too early in the podcast, but I would love to see some of that space utilized for vertical farming. Right? Like, how cool would that be?
It's very cool.
Yeah. But look, talking about buildings, at least in my research and in talking to people in the industry, building green buildings or electrifying new buildings shouldn't be a problem. I think it's an education problem. I think it's educating architects, construction worker, construction companies and the like of what's available to them and the benefits of it. I think the big problem is turning over the existing stock of buildings. That's where it gets costly. And that's where you need, some specific green financing or other ways, creative ways to incentivize the turnover of the existing stock of buildings.
And I would just add, again, investments on the grid side as well from electric utilities. The idea of smart grid and building out a modern grid is going to be important to this.
Yeah. And what is the incentive to, like, say, Florida Power and Light? Because generally they're not on our team. So
they're also an energy monopoly.
Well, right. So, but that's who runs the grid. So, that's how do you get them to be on our team?
I mean, electric utilities are an interesting sector, right? There are these kind of quasi-monopolies, often heavily regulated, right, in terms of even the prices that they charge and the like. So I think, that creates both barriers, but also creates opportunities. And we've seen this through policies renewable portfolio standards, for example, that are driving a lot of the adoption of renewables currently on the grid, being kind of required by law to do so. I think what is fearful, what people worry about, right, is that despite our needs to make these changes, people still want to have cheap electricity that is reliable. And so what we're talking about is massive capital expenditures that utilities need to make. And so the real question is kind of what will the consumer bear? And if not, then who's going to subsidize that? And so, you talk to utilities, many of them would say, hey, if we could pass on the cost of building out this massive, change in infrastructure to the consumer, we'd be happy to do it. That's not the reality that they often, live in there. So I think it's going to have to be a combination of things, subsidies, regulatory approaches, working hand in hand with utilities to get them to make this, transition. The good news is, we talk about this, is that in terms of the cost curves we're seeing for like solar and wind, they are now cost competitive with, things like natural gas in many applications. Now we still have the intermittency problem. We have to combine that with batteries. There's still a lot going on there. But increasingly, the utilities are just simply incentivize themselves to adopt these technologies, at least utility scale renewables, because the economics are favorable.
That is a great point. And one of the things that I actually thought about when I was living in a townhome community is the idea of, you want to call it like a solar co-op or any opportunity that is going to allow through the HOA to basically have, more or less bulk pricing for, 150 units, let's say, or more, that would be agreeable to going with a green technology like solar. I mean, to me, I think that that's immensely important and something that would definitely help mitigate it. But as we know, a lot of these HOAs and organizations, they have their own relationships that they typically form with, any of these energy conglomerates. And of course, in Florida, it's a big problem because we have an energy monopoly. I mean, Florida Power and Light is owned by NextEra Energy, which is one of the biggest probably in the world. And so dealing with that roadblock is a big problem. But I do think that one of the things we've noticed with the climate movement, it's mostly made up. I mean, again, most people believe in it, but it is a very youth-driven movement. And I think their righteous energy is good, but their strategy is not sound, at least not yet. And so the question is, how do you make it sound? And I do think things like this, like solar co-ops, I think could be very valuable. How do you guys see that in terms of more community-based energy instead of dealing with, let's say, fossil fuels? Now, a lot of the community could be run on solar, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you want to go ahead, Becky?
No, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, it's in essence treating a market that looked like a traditional, we generate electricity, we provide that to you, to a world in which we would call it like a two-sided market maker. Even think of like, Airbnb or Uber, right? Connecting producers and consumers. That's what the future of our electrical generation could look like. So as you're saying, you could have co-ops, you could have HOAs, you could have just individual homeowners. No longer are they just consuming electricity, but now they're producing it as well. And that creates this opportunity for the electric utilities, if they see it, to serve as this intermediary in the exchange of electricity. And that could be a very lucrative position to be in, actually, depending on how they price it and consider it. But it's a different mindset. And I think that's what's so hard. It's very different than saying, we are going to produce electricity and distribute it to you, to suddenly saying, we're going to be a facilitator for the exchange of electricity across what could be millions of sources of generation.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.